Welcome. In this video, I'm going to show you how to begin creating the structure and the files for a basic static website. Note that you should already have a Cloud9 environment created. Also note, I'm not going to be teaching you HTML or CSS. This video is about using Cloud9 to create the basic structure of your website folders and to begin editing your files. After that, you should be able to edit your files to make them look like your desired plan for your website. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are with our basic AWS Cloud9 environment. As you can see, I am looking at one folder over here in the Project Explorer area. This is the root folder for my environment. Before you begin creating a website, you should always do the thinking work ahead of time. For instance, decide what pages you're going to have and maybe draw some pictures called wireframes to design what your pages are going to look like. For this example, I'm simply going to have a static website with just a few pages which are linked together through navigation. I'm going to use a basic 3-column web format for each of my pages, and I'm going to include an image on one of those pages, and I'm going to connect all of my pages to a common CSS file. For fun, I may add a few other HTML items just to show you how to do that in Cloud9. However, keep in mind, the goal of this particular video is not to teach you HTML, but rather how to create the files in Cloud9. So here we see in the Project Explorer area a simple folder for our environment. We need to begin by creating a root folder for our web application. One way to do that is to right-click on the environment folder, choose New Folder. Now let's give our folder a name. I'll just call it my web site. Usually you'll give your sites more logical names than that. Next, I want to create the structure of files within this folder. With the website, it's very important to organize your files and various assets into a folder structure that you would then copy to whatever server is going to be hosting your site. This is because when you start to link pages together, whether that's an HTML page to another HTML page, or embedding an image within an HTML page, or perhaps connecting to a CSS file, you need to know where those files are in relation to one another. So it's best to start out with a folder structure in mind. For mine, I'm going to keep my basic HTML files directly in the My Website folder. We'll assume that this folder is the root folder of my application. I like to organize other things, for instance, images. If you have many of those, it's nice to organize those in a subfolder. And you can also organize other elements like CSS into subfolders. So let's do that. Under My Website, let's go create a few folders to put our files in. Right-click on My Website, again hit New Folder. Let's call this one Styles. This is where we're going to put our CSS files. Now, right-click on My Website, create a new folder. Let's call this one Images. Here is where I'm going to organize any image files that might be a part of my web pages. You could go on and on creating multiple folders, whatever you need to do to organize your particular website. Perhaps you might have some subfolders for some other assets like videos, audio. For instance, when your site starts to get lots of web pages, you might want to organize it further with multiple subdomain folders. In this case, we're just going to leave it with these so you can just see how to create folders. For our images, we're going to want to add an image. I have previously downloaded an image to my Downloads folder, so let's see how I can get an image file into my Images subfolder. So click on the Images subfolder to select it. Note, if you don't see the menu bar at the top, because you've collapsed it for some reason, you can always get it back. Just put your cursor up in that little bitty strip you see at the top and click on it, and you'll get your menu back. So now that we have selected our images subfolder, choose File from the menu, and let's do Upload Local Files. Now we can click Select Files. We can drag or drop files if we have our Finder or File Explorer. I'm going to select Files, go to my Downloads folder, pick one called uga.png, and hit Open. You can see over in the File Explorer area that I now have an image in my subfolder. You can click on the file, and you can see a preview of it in AWS Cloud9. Cloud9 also has some rudimentary editing tools for your image, such as flipping it or rotating it and cropping it, and perhaps even changing the size. You can note that the size of this particular image file is 400 pixels by 400 pixels, and that's what the default size would be on your web page, but of course you can alter how it actually is displayed using CSS. Let's close that. Let's add a CSS file to our Styles subfolder. One way to do this is to select the Styles subfolder, right-click on it, and select New File. Then we can type to give our file a name. I'm going to call it styles.css. Let's double-click on the file to open it. You see the file is open now in the editing window. Of course, there's nothing in it at the moment. I can easily add some CSS, perhaps for a P tag, a paragraph tag. I can make sure that the color will be blue. I'll be adding more CSS to this file, but I just wanted to show you that it would work. I'm going to leave this tab open because I may come back to edit it several times. But now that we have our Styles subfolder and our Style CSS, and we have our Images subfolder with one image in there, let's go to our root folder and create our first HTML file. This time, instead of right-clicking on the folder, I'm going to select the folder, then I'm going to the File option in the menu. Click on that. Notice you still have New File, but look at this thing called New from Template. This is something that can save us some time. I have templates for JavaScript, HTML, Python, PHP, and so forth, even Java console applications. We're making HTML this time, so select that and see what happens. Look at that, a new file has opened. Currently it's called untitled1.html. We'll change that later, but notice in the editor a couple of things that are pretty interesting. First, it pre-types some code for us. As you should know by now, this is the basic set of code for any HTML page. Notice also that HTML tags are color-coded in red, and it's giving us line numbers. The line numbers are helpful when we need to refer to a particular line, or perhaps if there's an error message that specifies a line where the error is occurring. Let's go ahead and add a title in here. So click in between the title tags, hit My Website. Let's put a little space in the body of the page so that we can add a HTML tag. I'm simply going to use a paragraph tag. Remember that in the CSS file we specified that paragraphs should be green. This is a paragraph with lots of words. Notice that on an HTML page, the actual content is color-coded in white. Now, one thing that's happened so far, you do not see in the Project Explorer this file yet. That's because it hasn't been saved. You can save in a couple ways. You can go to File, Save. Let's call it Save As, so that we can specify its file name. So it's going to put it in My Website. Be sure to check that it's going in the proper location, and you can change it to other places if you want. Let's call this one index.html. Index is a very common name for the file name that's going to be your home page, or the default page that opens if somebody visits this folder on a website. We're going to get in the habit in this course of always calling our home page index.html, and note that it's all lowercase. Click Save. Now you see in the tab that the file name has changed, and now you see that it appears in the Project Explorer underneath My Website folder. One thing to be careful of, notice that while it's sitting under Styles, it's not actually in that subfolder. The reason you know is if you look at the Styles subfolder, you see an arrow beside it. Note that that is pointing to the right. If I click on that arrow, the arrow points down, and you can see that the folder has been expanded to show me the files that are within it. There's only one. Note also that the file that is inside of that subfolder is indented in this view, showing that it is indeed contained within the Styles subfolder. So if I were to collapse that again by clicking on the arrow, you still see that index shows lower, but it's still at the same level as these subfolders. All of them are directly within the My Website folder. That's an important point, so note that. Let me show you something really quickly. We can actually preview our web pages in Cloud9, and it's very simple. Note there's preview at the top in the Run area of Cloud9. If I click on that, I have several options. In this case, I just want to preview the file index.html, so click on that. You see that another window opens, and we can see the only thing we currently have in this web page, which is the paragraph. Note that our paragraph is indeed in black, though. This is one way to troubleshoot your web page. Remember, we wanted it to be green because of the CSS. I have failed to do something so far to make it green, or to look at that CSS. Think about what I need to add. I'm going to close the preview to get it out of the way. Basically, I have not connected this web page to the appropriate CSS file. So I'm going to do that now. Note I can click anywhere I want my new link to be. I'm going to click at the end of the title tag. You might recall that the link tag, which will link a web page to CSS, is part of the head section of your HTML file. Note, one of the features of the editor is type ahead. If I type an L for the start of link, it's giving me some options to choose from. What if I type again, I? There's a link snippet. Watch what happens if I hover over the link snippet. Hey, that looks like exactly what I want. So simply click on it. Look, it entered in that code for me. So even though I'm typing some of the things in here, I can use the features of the editor to complete my code. Let's see. This has everything but the reference to the file that is down in the Styles subfolder. And the name of the file, I believe, was styles.css. Let me look at that to make sure. Yes, there is an S. Okay. I could also test it by previewing. Be sure to save, then preview. And now I can see that my paragraph is indeed green. So I am connecting to the CSS. I find it's often good just to create the simplest CSS file possible just to make sure I'm getting the connection, and then I go back and edit my CSS for more complex formats, as we'll do later. Another tip for you. Many of your pages are going to have a similar structure. Go look at some of your favorite websites and you'll note that as you go from page to page, there may be common elements, like in the header section at the top, the footer section at the bottom, and maybe the middle part is structured in various ways, like so many columns. So it's a good idea, as you look at your designs for your pages, to go ahead and include the common elements in your index file and put those in there only, then duplicate that file for the other pages you need, and then you can go back and edit each of those pages as needed for their particular purpose. So let's do that this way. First, I'm going to delete the paragraph. It was simply there to test my CSS link. And I am going to add a few things. First, I'm going to make a div. And this div, I'm going to give it the class name container. This will hold all of the stuff that I'm working with. This is a nice div because I can use this to format things within the entire page. Inside of the container, I'm going to have a header. Maybe I'll make sure you can see what it is with an H1 tag. Note how I'm just typing where I need to type my HTML and putting in the content as needed. Let me make a comment here. HTML comment. Put some nav here later. I'm going to add my navigation to the header section. I'm going to go ahead and type a few things ahead, and then I'll be back in a minute to show you what I end up with. So you can see I've built a little bit more to the basic structure of my web pages. With the header, footer, and div tags, I've divided the page into various sections. First, I have a header section. This is going to be visually on the top of the browser page. I have a footer section, and this will be visually at the bottom of the web page. And in between, I've called that section main. Now, main, I've divided up into 3 columns: a left column, a middle column, and a right column. Each one of those, for the time being, has a header in them that tells what they are, and it has a paragraph for main content. Note, before we save it, look at that tab. There's a circle in the tab. That circle indicates that you have not saved. There are changes to your file that have not yet been saved. So I'm going to save. I'm on a Mac. I'm going to hit Command S. Remember, you can also go to File, Save, or you could do Control S on a Windows machine. So that should be saved. Let's see what it looks like in preview. Not much at the moment. I do see I have an extra angle bracket somewhere, and these things just showing linearly. That's because I need to apply some CSS. Let me couple other additions to my page, and then we'll go fix up the CSS. First, can you see where that extraneous angle bracket is? Note how the color coding helps at the moment. Look up the header tag. The header tag is in red, but you notice just before that there's a white angle bracket. That must be the extra one that was showing up on the page. Note also how in our code there is some indentation, so we can see what is contained in between each HTML tag. Notice the line that goes down from the head tag to the /head tag. Anything inside of that line is contained within that HTML structure. So several things in the editor can visually help you work with your code and understand what's going on. Okay, let's go to my CSS file. I'm going to add a bit more CSS, and we're going to fade out a little bit as I do that, and when we come back you're going to see a little bit more in here, and I'll tell you what that's about. Okay, as you can see, I've added a bit more CSS, and this CSS is here so that it will divide those various portions of the page and make them look appropriate. So you can note that for the header and the footer, I'm using the same styling. I'm giving them the same background color, and I also have aligned the text center with 20x padding. Now for the other sections, remember those were specified as div with this particular class name. To specify that I want to work with a class, I use the dot attribute in CSS, as you've learned. Here I'm using flex display, which is going to help me in making the columns different size. So this is the outer container of the columns, and recall I have a middle column and a left and right column. Here's some things for the main. So it's going to take up pretty much one flex size of the container. I have my left column, Flex 1, background color for that, padding and so forth, and a border so we can see it. And note I've used Flex 2 here because I want my middle column to be twice as wide as my other column. Notice a couple other things. There's a warning up at line 1. I've used something known as a universal selector, which is commonly used in CSS, but Cloud9 is telling me that, hey, you sure you want to use that? It's known to be slow. Well, thanks for the warning, Cloud9, but I'm going to choose to keep it for now. I may find a better way someday. Also notice the circle. So I have not saved this page. Notice the circle's turned to an X, showing that it's been saved. Back in my HTML, it also needs to be saved, but let's run a preview to see what our CSS did. Now look at that. Now I have a header section, left column, right column, my center column's twice as big as the right and left, and a footer section. Anything that's a paragraph tag is showing up as green. The only other common element that I want on all of my pages is actually a navigation section. I'm going to add that into my header section. I hope to make it into a set of what looks like buttons that you can click on to go to the various pages in my website. So to start, let's edit our comment a little bit, just so that it says nav here. A nice tip if you want to have comments in any of your code, it's a good idea to go ahead and comment before you code it, and then you can leave it in later. There is a nav tag, so I'm going to choose to use that. Notice here's a snippet. We'll take that. I'm actually going to give my nav a class name, and we'll call this nav bar. Now I'm going to have multiple links in this particular thing for my navigation. So I'll put the first one, A. Notice the A snippet is what we're using for a hyperlink. I'm going to have this one go to my home page, which is index.html, but I'm going to show the users that it just says home. I can use the same type of head for my other hyperlinks. And let's call this page 2.html. Of course, in a real site, I would give them more appropriate names. I think for the next couple, I'm going to copy and paste and convert them to page 3 and 4. Again, the names of the files can change. You don't have to call them page 3 and 4. That's just for illustrative purposes. Okay, there's a bit of nav that would show up. What happens if I preview that? I like to preview very often because I like to code a little bit and then test it. Code a little bit and test it. Let's get rid of the old preview. Oh, make sure you've saved your file, then hit preview. And it looks like in blue, I don't really like the color there, but the blue is showing up as hyperlinks. They're not quite yet boxes like I want them to be, but that's for CSS to do. What happens if I click on one? Oops, file not found. If this were running through a real browser, it would show a 404 error. Same thing, file not found. Okay, but that's known. It's not really an error, is it? Because I haven't created those other files yet. If I look over here, I only have index.html. I'm going to copy index.html to make those pretty soon. Now let's make our nav bar look like we want it to do. So for that I need to edit CSS. I'm going to go down here at the bottom, add a little bit more CSS. When we fade back in, I'll show you the CSS I've added and explain it to you. Okay, here we have our CSS for our nav bar. And note for the nav bar, I'm setting a particular background color and some padding, and I'm justifying it to center. I'm going to have several buttons, we're calling them, that are going to give them some text decoration. And some background color. If I hover over it, it should change the color of the button. Let's save my file. Go back to index and hit preview and see what we come up with. Okay, so I previewed this and something's not working right. So what do I need to do? I need to troubleshoot it. Well, one thing I notice in my CSS is I do have something called nav button, but I do not have anything in my HTML that matches nav button. So I've actually left off a class designation that's important here. But with an editor, that's easy to fix. So I'll type that in. Then I'm simply going to copy that, paste that into each of my sections. Make sure you save. Let's preview that again. Oh, now they look like buttons. We still have the problem that the other pages are not created yet, so we need to create those. But as I was saying, the whole purpose is let's create the basic structure for all of our pages in index.html, and then let's make copies of it to start our other pages. So to do that, right-click on index.html. Notice down in the menu there's one that says duplicate. Okay, so we got index 1. Let's rename that to page 2. All right, let's duplicate that one. Well, we can rename that. Just simply click on it. Let's call that one page 3. I'll duplicate page 3. I'll rename that to page 4. Okay, and let's go back to our index page and preview that again now. But they all look the same, and of course they look the same. They're all from the same template. Speaking of template, we are going to go in a minute and make those pages unique. It might be important that we still contain this web page as a template just in case we need to have more pages later. So I'm going to duplicate index one more time, and this is not really going to be a file that would show up to users, but I'm going to call this template.html just so I have a starter file. If I need to make a page 5, I can always duplicate that and start from scratch with page 5. Let's go make them a little bit unique so we can see that they differentiate from each other when we click on them. Let's go edit index.html, and remember the image that we stored in the images? Let's put that in our main content window. I for image. Image snippet. Oh, it looks pretty good. All I need to do is add the source here. That's down in my images folder. uga.png. Save. Preview. Oh, look at that. Nice picture shows up there. I can already tell that if I go to page 2, 3, or 4, it's different than being on the home page. Let's edit them a little bit as well. Let's go to page 2, and let's simply put page 2 main content down in the middle column, and do the same for page 3 and 4. Be sure to save. Let's refresh. A couple other things you can do with the preview is if you already have it open, you can click on refresh to see the changes. Notice if I go to page 2, it says page 2 main content, page 3, page 4. So now I know there are at least the different pages, and my website is working fine as it is. Another thing that you can do in the preview, notice this box with an arrow. You can pop it out into a new window, into a new browser tab. Let's see that. Look at that. Now it's reopened in another tab, and I can see what it looks like in an actual browser. Pretty nifty. Okay, I think I'm actually going to stop right here. Just to summarize what we've done today is we created our folder structure first so that we have a place to put the various files that we want to, and we can refer to them in the appropriate way with relative links. Then we uploaded an image into our images folder, and of course you could upload that into any folders you create. In our styles folder, we created a CSS file to hold our CSS, and then in our root folder is where I've placed my HTML files. To do that, we created one file with our basic structure, and then we duplicated that so that we don't have to do all that work again in those new files, and we can just edit the appropriate sections. Thanks for watching. Be sure to practice this with the HTML that you are learning.